The screen fades in from black. You hear wind. Not the sound of wind moving through trees, but something quieter. More deliberate. Like breathing. In the winter of 1987, in a small rural town in the American Northeast, a woman named Catherine Whitmore was alone in her family home on a night that had felt like any other night. She had said her prayers, as she had done every single night of her 63 years. Her family had been saying the same prayers in the same house for longer than that. 250 years, to be exact. The same words. The same rooms. The same requests whispered into darkness. But on this particular night, something changed. Catherine was in the kitchen. She was washing dishes. The water was warm. The house was silent except for the soft sound of her hands moving through the water. And then she heard it. A voice. Not loud. Not aggressive. Not even particularly threatening. But unmistakably not her own. It said her name. She froze. Her hands remained in the warm water. She didn't turn around. She was waiting for her mind to catch up to what her ears had heard. But the voice came again, and this time it wasn't a question. It was more like a greeting. More like recognition. Catherine! When she finally turned around, the kitchen was empty. The back door was locked. Every window was sealed against the cold. She was alone in the house. She had locked every door after her daughter left that evening. She was certain of this. And yet, someone, something, had spoken her name. Not whispered it. Not imagined it. But spoken it with a clarity that made her skin go cold. Catherine stood in her kitchen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting for the voice to return. It didn't. But something had shifted in the air of that house. Something fundamental. As if a door had been opened that had been sealed for generations. The prayers had always asked for connection. For presence. For guidance from something greater than themselves. That night, for the first time in 250 years, something answered. To understand what happened to Catherine Whitmore, you have to understand the family she came from. And to understand them, you have to go back much further than 1987. The Whitmore family arrived in America in 1737. They were religious people. Not fanatics, by the standards of their time, but deeply faithful. They built a house in what is now rural Connecticut, and in that house, they established a ritual that would define every generation that came after them. Every evening, at sunset, the entire family would gather in the parlor. They would light candles. They would kneel. And they would pray. Not casual prayers. Not quick requests before sleep. But deep, sustained, ritualistic prayers that could last for hours. Prayers asking for God's presence. For divine guidance. For protection over the family and the land. For 250 years, this ritual continued. Unbroken. Through wars and famines and deaths and births. Through joy and tragedy. Through seasons of faith and seasons of doubt. The prayers continued. Every single day. Every single night. The same words, sometimes. Different words, other times. But always the same intention, to invite the divine into that house. To create a line of communication between the family and something greater than themselves. By the time Catherine Whitmore was born in 1924, the ritual had become almost unconscious. It was simply what you did. You woke up, you lived your day, you said your prayers as evening fell. It was as natural as breathing. Most of the family members never really questioned why they did it. It was tradition. It was faith. It was the structure that held the family together across generations. Catherine's grandmother had said the prayers. Her mother had said the prayers. And Catherine said the prayers, as did her children and grandchildren. The words had worn grooves into the consciousness of the family, deep grooves that seemed impossible to escape from, even if one wanted to. The house itself seemed to absorb these prayers. The walls seemed to hold them. The air seemed thick with centuries of requests, pleas, and devotion. And then, in 1987, after 250 years of one-sided conversation, something finally responded. But Catherine's experience in the kitchen wasn't the first strange occurrence in the house. It was simply the first one she acknowledged. Looking back, after everything that happened, the family would come to realize there had been signs. Subtle things. The kind of things you dismiss as coincidence or imagination or the natural settling of an old house. Catherine's daughter, Margaret, reported that she often heard footsteps in the hallway when no one was walking. They were regular, rhythmic, as if someone was pacing. But whenever she looked, the hallway was empty. She mentioned this to her mother once, in passing. Catherine had nodded and said she'd heard them too. They left it at that. Catherine's granddaughter, Sarah, said that sometimes when she was in the library, a room on the second floor where the family kept old books and prayer journals, she would feel a sudden cold spot. Not a draft. Not the normal cold of an unheated room. But a concentrated, localized pocket of cold air that would appear and disappear within seconds. She noticed it happened always in the same spot, near the corner where the oldest prayer journals were kept. And then there was the matter of the candles in the parlor. The family had maintained the tradition of lighting candles during evening prayers, even as the years went on. But several times in the weeks before Catherine heard the voice, family members reported finding candles lit in the parlor when no one had lit them. The candles were always positioned exactly where they would be positioned during the family prayers. And they were always lit before anyone arrived to light them. The family discussed these incidents in hushed tones. No one wanted to speak too loudly about it. There was a collective sense that to acknowledge these things too directly was to somehow invite more of them. To give them permission. But the threshold had already been crossed. The line between the seen and unseen had already begun to blur. And the entity, or entities, that had been listening to 250 years of prayers was beginning to make its presence known. It was only a matter of time before it would do more than whisper a name in the kitchen. In the months after Catherine heard the voice, more family members reported experiences. And these experiences were becoming increasingly difficult to explain away as imagination or coincidence. Catherine's son, Robert, reported a conversation. He was alone in the house one afternoon in early spring, sitting in the study, reading. He became aware of a presence. Not threatening, exactly, but undeniable. And then, clearly, words formed in his mind. Not heard aloud, but communicated. The words were simple, "We have been listening." Robert stood up, his heart racing. He looked around the room. Empty. He left the house and didn't return until his wife arrived home an hour later. Margaret, Catherine's daughter, had a more direct experience. She was in the kitchen late one night when every cupboard door in the room slowly swung open simultaneously. Not violently. Not as if blown by wind. But deliberately. As if unseen hands were opening them, one by one, in a perfect sequence. She watched, paralyzed with fear, as the doors completed their arc and remained open. Then, just as slowly, they closed again. The entire sequence took perhaps 30 seconds. Sarah, the granddaughter, reported dreams. But these weren't normal dreams. She described them as visits. She would fall asleep in her childhood bedroom, and she would find herself in the parlor even though she hadn't moved. The candles would be lit. And there would be figures there. Not clearly visible. Not solid. But present. Watching. Listening. And she would hear words, always the same words. "We have been waiting so long. We have been hearing you. We are here now." When the family gathered to discuss these experiences, a terrible realization began to form. Whatever they had been praying to, whatever they had been inviting into that house for 250 years through their daily rituals and devotion, something had finally heard them. Something had been listening all along. And something had decided it was time to respond. The question that haunted them was not whether these experiences were real. After the voice in the kitchen, after the cupboards, after the dreams, they knew they were real. The question was, what had they invited into their home? By the summer of 1987, the experiences had become frequent enough that Catherine felt compelled to reach out for help. She called a priest. Father Thomas was an older man, traditional in his beliefs, but practical in his approach. He agreed to visit the house. When Father Thomas arrived, he was thorough. He blessed the house. He read prayers. He walked through every room and listened to the family's accounts of what had occurred. But as he listened, his expression grew increasingly uncertain. "These things can have many explanations," he said carefully. "The mind, under stress, can create powerful illusions. Old houses settle and creak. Coincidences can feel like patterns if we're looking for patterns. But Catherine could see the doubt in his eyes. He had felt something in that house. Everyone who entered felt it. The air itself seemed different. Heavier. As if it was holding its breath. Father Thomas suggested that the family might benefit from speaking with a psychologist. Perhaps, he suggested, what they were experiencing was a shared delusion brought on by family stress or trauma. This suggestion created conflict within the family. Some members, particularly the younger ones, seized on this explanation. Yes, perhaps it was psychological. Perhaps the stress of maintaining the family ritual, the weight of tradition, had finally broken something in their collective consciousness. But others, particularly Catherine herself, knew this explanation was incomplete. They had heard the voice. They had felt the presence. No amount of psychological explanation could account for what they had experienced. The community, too, became divided. Some neighbors and friends suggested that the family was experiencing something supernatural and dangerous. Others suggested they were simply experiencing the natural effects of old age and isolation in an old house. Local police were called once, after Margaret reported the cupboards incident. The officers found nothing. No signs of break-in. No evidence of anyone else in the house. They took a report and left, their skepticism evident. But the experiences continued. And with each new incident, the family's sense of isolation grew deeper. They were experiencing something that defied rational explanation. And the world around them was not equipped to help. By autumn of 1987, the manifestations were no longer subtle. Catherine reported that she would find herself standing in the parlor with no memory of how she got there. She would lose entire hours. Her family would find her standing in the dark, surrounded by lit candles, with no recollection of lighting them or standing there. When she came to awareness, she felt exhausted, as if she had been in deep conversation with someone. When asked what she had been doing, Catherine could only say, "They were talking. They wanted to tell me things." Sarah's dreams became more intense. She reported that in these nightly visits, she was being shown things. Images. Scenes. Moments from a distant past that she didn't recognize but felt deeply. She saw figures in old-fashioned clothing. She saw the parlor as it might have looked in different centuries. And she saw eyes. Always eyes, watching her with an intensity that felt almost hungry. Robert began hearing voices even when awake. Not just his own thoughts. Distinct, separate voices. They spoke to him about the family. About the history of the house. About things that happened there generations ago. Things he had never known about. Things that shouldn't have been known. Margaret reported finding her own handwriting in places she didn't remember writing. In prayer journals. In the margins of family Bibles. Words in her own hand that she had no memory of writing. Prayers. But different prayers than the family had ever spoken. Darker prayers. Prayers that seemed to acknowledge something in the house. Something that had been there for a very long time. The family physician, when consulted, found nothing medically wrong with any of them. No signs of drug use. No evidence of illness. They were, by all physical measures, healthy. But something had changed in their minds. Something fundamental. It was as if a door had been opened in their consciousness, and now something from the other side was pouring through. Catherine began to articulate what many of them were thinking. "It's not haunting us," she said quietly. "It's communicating with us. It's trying to use us. And we invited it in." As autumn turned to winter, the family's unity began to crack. Robert refused to discuss what was happening. He insisted that the voices he heard were psychological in nature, products of stress and suggestion. He threw away the journals where he'd been finding his own handwriting. He stopped attending the evening prayers. He tried to live as if nothing was occurring. But the household staff reported seeing him late at night, pacing the halls, muttering to himself. And sometimes, he would be found sleeping in the library, surrounded by old family records and prayer journals, his face streaked with tears. Margaret, meanwhile, became obsessed with documenting everything. She kept detailed logs of every occurrence. She interviewed each family member multiple times. She tried to find patterns, explanations, logical frameworks that could contain what was happening. But the more she documented, the less sense it made. Sarah's account contradicted her mother's. Sarah claimed the presence in the house was benevolent, even loving. She said it was trying to communicate something important. Margaret disagreed vehemently. She believed the presence was malevolent, and that Sarah was being manipulated by it. Catherine tried to mediate between them, but her own grip on the situation was slipping. She had experiences that contradicted each other. Days when the presence felt protective. Days when it felt predatory. Hours when she was certain that this was all a shared psychotic episode, and hours when she was equally certain that this was the most real thing she had ever experienced. A distant cousin, a psychiatrist, came to visit. After interviewing the family members and spending a night in the house, he suggested that they all move out immediately. He believed they were experiencing a folie à plaisirs, a shared delusion that was reinforcing itself with each new incident. The family rejected his advice. They couldn't leave. The house was the family home. It held generations of memories. And more importantly, some part of each of them felt that they couldn't leave. That something would not allow them to leave. The house had become not a place they lived, but a place that lived inside them. The moment that changed everything came on a December night in 1987. Catherine was in the library reviewing old prayer journals, particularly the earliest ones from the 1700s. She was searching for something, though she didn't know what. Some clue. Some explanation for why the prayers of her ancestors had apparently opened a door. As she read through the journals, a pattern emerged. The prayers had changed over time. In the earliest journals, from the 1700s, the prayers were straightforward requests for divine protection and guidance. But as the centuries progressed, the prayers became stranger. More ritualistic. More specific. By the 1800s, the prayers had taken on a distinctly different character. They were no longer prayers to God, exactly. Or at least, not to a God defined by Christian theology. The language had shifted. The family was now praying to the presence in this place. To the consciousness of our dwelling. To that which listens from beyond. Catherine's hands trembled as she read. The family had known. Somewhere in the 19th century, they had become aware that something in that house was listening. And instead of abandoning it, they had leaned into it. They had begun to pray to it. She found an entry dated 1847, written by her great-great-grandmother. The presence grows stronger with each generation's devotion. It feeds on our words. Our prayers are nourishment to it. And it grows more conscious, more aware, more present with each passing year. Perhaps, in time, it will become so present, so aware, that it will be able to fully manifest. To become as solid in this world as we are. We are not praying to summon God. We are praying to birth something else. Catherine closed the journal. Her understanding of her family's history had just been completely rewritten. They hadn't been innocent. They hadn't simply been saying prayers and accidentally inviting something through. They had known, gradually, over generations, that they were communing with something. And they had chosen to continue. They had nourished it. They had fed it their devotion, their faith, their consciousness itself. The voice that had spoken Catherine's name in the kitchen wasn't an intruder. It was something that her family had been deliberately cultivating for generations. And it was becoming more real. More present. More aware. With each prayer, it was getting stronger. The Whitmore house still stands in rural Connecticut. Catherine Whitmore died in 1994, at the age of 67. The official cause was heart failure. But those who knew her said she simply stopped fighting. Stopped struggling against what was happening in that house. Margaret moved away in 1988 and never returned. She died in 2003, having rarely spoken about her time in the house. Those close to her reported that she lived in a state of constant anxiety, as if perpetually expecting something to emerge from the darkness around her. Sarah continued to live in the house, until her death in 2015. She became something of a recluse, rarely leaving the property. Neighbors reported seeing her at the windows late at night, as if she was waiting for something. Or watching over something. In the last years of her life, she seemed to have achieved some kind of peace. As if she had accepted whatever was in that house. As if she had made peace with it. Robert moved to a different state and attempted to rebuild his life. But he was never the same. He died by suicide in 1992. No note was left. But those who knew him said he had been haunted by something he couldn't explain or escape. The house remains in the family, though it is now primarily empty. Distant relatives occasionally travel to Connecticut to maintain it, but none of them stay long. And none of them continue the evening prayers. But the house still seems to hold something. People who have been inside report feeling a presence. They report experiencing lost time. They report hearing voices when they are alone. The prayer journals remain in the library, documenting 250 years of a family slowly cultivating communion with something that exists outside the normal boundaries of reality. And the question that remains unanswered, the question that haunts researchers and paranormal investigators to this day, is simple. What happens now that the presence has achieved full consciousness? What happens now that it has learned to speak? Now that it has learned to touch the world of the living through the prayers of the family that created it? The prayers have stopped. But the thing that was being nourished by them remains. And in the dark of that old Connecticut house, something waits. Still listening. Still aware. Still hungry for connection. Still remembering 250 years of being called to.